In the name of God, in this session, we will continue our discussion about the generative linguistic and generative school. As it may be, the revolution was followed by a series of evolutions. Many schools have emerged in the past 50 years, usually retaining the principal ideas and framework of cognitivism, but in many other respects fully diverging from Chomsky and his followers. This has often led to terminological problems, since most schools have been either cognitive or generative in nature. But there has simply not been enough appropriate words to name them in a way which would succinctly explain how they are different from orthodox generative linguistics. In the most serious such clash to date, from the once unified generative linguistics of early Chomsky in 1970s, at least two major schools emerged, one of which retained the name generative and the other called itself cognitive linguistics. Dear student, and slide, you should know this point, the date of creating generative linguistic and cognitive linguistic. I want to repeat these lines, that in the most serious such as clash to date, from the once unified generative linguistic of early Chomsky, in the 1970s at least two major schools emerged. At the 1970s, two major schools emerged. One of them was generative and another one was cognitive linguistics. You should know its date, their dates. Today, this presents us with a problem of the superordinate, a higher order term that would encompass both or all groups of school. Although generative linguistics is a chronologically older conception, I propose the phrase cognitive linguistics in the broader sense for the entire big field. This should be so, I believe, because human cognition is a principal research subject of the schools of Chomsky and followers, generativist. Lakoff and followers, cognitivists in the narrow sense, and also many maverick approaches, the most distinguished of which is probably the conceptual theory of Ray Jackendoff. The fifth legacy of generative linguistics, starting from the very name of the field, is unfortunately terminological chaos. Awkward as it might be, I believe, the phrase cognitive linguistic in the broader sense is at least a way out for the name of entire big domain. 50 years of its region deserve at least that much. Okay, here explain about the cognitive linguistic, and here it's compare it to the generative phonology, generative linguistics. Universals, grammar, and formal systems. We want to read about this concept, these terms in generative linguistics, about the universals, grammar, formal systems. Through history of linguistics, we find the rift between descriptions searching for differences and providing comparative overviews of individual languages. In schools dealing with language, the universal human capacity for symbolic communication. The universal human capacity for symbolic communication. Generative linguistics belongs to the latter group and is thus a universalist theory, like a theory pursuing language universals, as it claims that principal similarities can be found among all languages of the world. The generative theory holds that such similarities prove that there is a strong genetic disposition for language, which Chomsky calls the Innateness Hypothesis in this year. Dear student, it is very important because One of the important terms in generative linguistics is innateness, which comes from Chomsky. And it belongs to generative linguistics. And here in this paragraph, explain about the meaning of the universal, and it relates it to the Chomsky. I want to repeat it because it is very important. You should know the meaning of universal term, and you should know that the person which are involved and believe in such a term. Through history of linguistics, we find the rift between description searching for differences and providing comparative overview of individual languages in schools dealing with language. Okay, here you will read about the universal. The universal human capacity for symbolic communication. Generative linguistics belongs to the latter group and is thus a universalist theory. Generative linguistics is a universalist theory, like theory pursuing language universals. Okay, generative linguistics is a universalist theory, like a theory pursuing language universal, as it claims that principled similarity can here we will read about the meaning of the meaning of the universal term, which it focus on the similarities which can be found among all languages of the world. It is the meaning of universals, means those similarities which found among all languages of the world. And the generative theory holds that such similarities prove that there is a strong genetic disposition for language. They are related and connecting to the concept of universal, which Chomsky calls that Innateness hypothesis, which they are genetically exist in for language. Therefore, you should know that what Chomsky means by Innateness hypothesis about the concept of universal and the other matters. In other words, linguistic competence, dear student. I know that you read about the competence and performance of Chomsky, and here in universals focus on the linguistic competence. What we mean by linguistic competence, you should know its definition, which is the ability of the individual to correctly use his or her native language is largely inborn and thus available to every healthy human being. It is very important. Maybe I ask you this question for the final exam, or I want you to mention it in your summarization, which what we mean by linguistic competence. You know that linguistic competence is related to the universals, and the linguistic competence is related to Chomsky, and it means that the ability of the individual to correctly use his or her native language is largely inborn and thus available to every healthy human being. This view is often termed linguistic nativism. Linguistic nativism, a direct offshoot of the rationalist philosophy of mind. This believing in linguistic competence is the work of rationalists like Chomsky, the rationalist philosopher, which we call it as a nativism. By nativism, we mean that competence which exists in inborn, and it exists in healthy human being. The sixth important legacy of generative linguistics is therefore the return to the problem of language universals, with the strong focus on the genetic origin of language faculty. It is very important. These bold lines are important. That in the generative linguistics, the return to the problem of language universals, with a strong focus on the genetic origins of the language faculty. The impact of this legacy is so strong today that one could claim it conceptually responsible for the supremacy of two leading research fields, genetic and cognitive science, whose small segments are often associated with problem of language. You should know this term of generative linguistics. Chomsky's claim of there being a largely innate capacity for language paved the way for the fundamental concept of the generative theory, universal grammar. Chomsky claimed that there being a largely innate capacity for language paved the way for the fundamental concept of generative theory, which is universal grammar. And here in this paragraph, explain about universal grammar and its term. The term grammar has been used in the same mentalistic epistemological framework. This is no longer a perspective discipline urging one to correctly use a form, but a descriptive explanatory theory trying to predict and explain the way in which our mind manipulates linguistic structures. Universal grammar is the inborn capacity. Here we have the definition of universal grammar, and you should know that. Universal grammar is the inborn capacity of the healthy individual to master his or her mother tongue and develop a full linguistic intuition. What we mean by universal grammar? Maybe I ask you to choose the correct definition for universal grammar, or maybe I put it in a slot and I want you to put the correct term. As a whole, you should know its definition, that universal grammar is the inborn capacity of the healthy individual to master his or her mother tongue and develop a full linguistic intuition. This intuition is different from the classical term in psychology, the ability to solve problems through direct insight. Linguistic intuition is merely unconscious knowledge. You should know the meaning of linguistic intuition. By linguistic intuition, we mean unconscious knowledge of the mother tongue. Unconscious knowledge of the mother tongue, an individual possesses and manipulate without any visible effort. What we mean by a universal grammar, what we mean by linguistic intuition. The universal grammar is the inborn capacity of the healthy individual to master his or her mother tongue and develop a full linguistic intuition. What we mean by linguistic intuition? We mean unconscious knowledge of the mother tongue an individual possesses and manipulates without any visible effort, and it is a direct consequence of universal grammar. We should know them, it is important. Universal grammar leaves room to create any grammatical structure in any world language. This room is filled up with a set of rules known as linguistic principles. We should know the meaning of universal linguistic principle. Universal grammar leaves room to create any grammatical structure in any world language. This room is filled up with a set of rules which we know that as linguistic principles. After a certain period of human life, most authors believe by puberty, during the so-called critical period of language acquisition, the ability to acquire all principles rules is lost. All principle is lost, and only those relevant to the mother tongue of the individual remain. Specialized rules that exist in some languages and not necessarily in others, which more precisely define the way in which principles are realized in the given language, are known as a linguistic parameter. You should know the meaning of linguistic principle, which exists in all of the language, which focus on the similarity of the language, and you should know the meaning of linguistic parameter, which linguistic parameter are language special, which they are different from language to other language. You should know their meaning. That a specialized rule, here we define the parameters, linguistic parameters, which a specialized rule that exists in some languages. Here we have the definition of parameters, language parameters or linguistic parameters, which they are specialized rules that exist in some languages, not all of the languages. Parameter principle exists in all of the languages, but parameter exists in some languages and not necessarily in other, which more precisely define the way in which principles are realized in a given language, which we know them as a linguistic parameter. The principles and parameters theory also emerged nearly 50 years ago with the first generative model, but it was first allowed key importance to the mid-80s. According to the all of this paragraph, this paragraph, and this paragraph about the universal grammar and formal system, all of them matter are important, and you should summarize them and you should know them for your final exam, because they are the important point and the important terms in generative linguistic. And as a linguist, you should know the idea and the terms and the concept of each school. According to the principles and parameters theory, universal grammar doesn't need to fulfill all its principles in all individual languages. Therefore, it is typical of every language to have an inborn competence accorded with the principles and an acquired component manifested only in the concrete language picked up from the environment. The combination of universal grammar and acquired parameters make up the grammar of an individual language, or mental grammar. Dear student, here we have the grammar of individual language, which is the combination of universal grammar, the similarity between languages, and the acquired parameters of that special language, which we call that as a grammar of individual language or mental grammar. The complex interrelation between universal and mental grammar and its consequences for language acquisition remain important goals of generative linguistics. As it may be, the extended usage of the term grammar remains the seventh legacy of generative linguistics, rather than a mere set of rules for correct speech or writing. Grammar is today mentally based, largely inborn capacity that govern our use of virtually any cognitive faculty, from language, our music, to vision. Apart, you should know the meaning of grammar of the individual language. Apart from the psychology, it seems that the generative theory owes a lot of natural sciences and mathematics. Its goal is to describe the expressiveness of language, like our ability to use a finite set of rules and a bit more substantial but still finite set of lexical units to build a potentially infinite number of new or novel sentences. Attempting to create a theory which would ideally allow even the most unintelligent imaginary computing device, such as Turing machine, to create all in only grammatical sentences of the given language. With minimal error coefficient, the generative theory uses many instruments available in first-order logic and mathematics. This means the theory is markedly formal, with sets of symbols and operations to manipulate them, which do not how refer to the content of what is being said. Okay, here it's explain about the here about the formal systems. They are not as important as the previous matter. Apart from the mathematics and logic, generative linguistics is methodologically close to the theoretical endeavors in the natural science. Okay, here in the previous paragraph, describe the relationship between mathematics and generative linguistic. Here in this paragraph, you will read about the relation between the logic, among the logic, mathematics, and generative, which they are near to the natural sciences. It is accorded with fundamental empirical knowledge of the human brain. Here describe the relation between the generative linguistic and natural sciences, which it is accorded with fundamental empirical knowledge of the human brain, but in a sense it still remains a speculative discipline based mainly on rationalist deduction. As such, the theory is constantly falsified in the Popperian sense of the word. As soon as a model turns out to be empirically incorrect, not fully adequate, or simply too complicated, it gives way to the next, more adequate one. Thus, the theory is not really trying to fathom the factual truth about the human brain. Rather, it is striving to constantly improve its own methodology in order to get as close to this truth as rationally possible. Chomsky believes no natural science has gone further than this, so that even such an apparently modest goal cannot be taken as a drawback of the language science. This paragraph and this paragraph are not very important, and there is a need to summarize them. And here we will read about the relationship between generative linguistics and other science. I just read it, and I think it is not so important. In more recent revisions of generative linguistics, authors have tried to reconcile descriptive adequacy, precise description of roles in individual languages that tend to be very complex, and explanatory adequacy, the need for the mental system used by the child acquiring this set of rules to be ultimately simple. This dualism is currently being investigated in the minimalist program and in Chomsky's own work. Its methodology is closer to that of theoretical chemistry. Here, we explain two concepts which are important. One of them is descriptive adequacy. Another one is explanatory adequacy. Dear student, you should know the meaning of these two adequacy: descriptive and explanatory. By descriptive adequacy, we mean description of rules in individual languages that tend to be very complex. And by explanatory adequacy, we mean the need for the mental system used by the child acquiring this set of rules to be ultimately simple. This dualism is currently being investigated in the minimalist program, which is a kind of generative linguistics. And in Chomsky's own word, this methodology is closer to that of the theoretical chemistry. Chemistry. Quite obviously from the paragraphs above, the writer suggests that the eighth major legacy of generative linguistics should be the deletion of clear boundaries between the social and natural science. Okay, this is important. You should know the eighth legacy of generative linguistics, which is the deletion of clear boundaries between the social and the natural sciences. On this view, the social sciences are ultimately mind sciences. As speculations, they first assume formal descriptions, as in mathematics and logic, and then seek verification in psychology. Ultimately, biology, formalists and functionalists stop here. As does Chomsky in 1986. Radical, eliminative materialists, however, believe that ultimate facts, even in the social sciences, should be sought in physics. whichever of the two stands one should take. It is quite clear now that the gap between the heard and soft senses is becoming all but bridged. About the dualism and consequences. Dear student, I want you to read these footnotes for your further reading, and when some terms are not clear, you can read the footnotes for getting more information about them to clarify that. The idea of language dualism has been with us for centuries. Its first clear definition probably kept with the Port-Royal School. In this some clarification, it became central to Saussure's teaching. You know that Saussure has some dualism or dichotomies. Platonistically, Saussure made the distinction between language and abstract system delineated by natural, psychological, and physiological laws, language structure or like, and the partly distorted concrete realization of this system, creating a speech or writing which is a speech or parole. Here, dear student, we have again the definition of parole and langue, which Saussure mentioned them before. Should know that a langue is a natural, psychological, and physiological laws, and it is abstract, but parole is a distorted concrete realization of this system which created speech or writing. Chomsky accepted this distinction, translated it into his own cognitivistic system, and defined it as the difference between the speaker and hearer's idealized knowledge of the language, linguistic competence, and his or her concrete usage of the language, which is linguistic performance. Dear student, Chomsky equal the Saussure langue to competence and use the performance for Saussure parole, which their details were similar. They were not the same. They were similar. Therefore, Chomsky used the term competence for the Saussure langue and used the term performance for the Saussure terms parole, which they are their concept and details are similar and they are not the same. Labels for these two phenomena have often changed in previous decades, so that competence has often been called just language faculty and performance language production. Here you can read other terms for these dichotomies. Instead of terms competence or faculty, many theorists today use the phrase language cognition, obviously in a much narrower sense than the one the writer or the author proposed above. It's important to notice that the distinction has mainly persisted throughout the development of generative grammar. The postulated psychological distinction between competence and performance resulted in two apparently separated structures in the formal generative theory. Originally, these were, of course, type structure, which representing the most abstract basic construct of the speaker, start in the discourse, and the surface structure, which is a result of transformational procedures, over the deep structure representing that which speaker or hearer actually pronounce or hears. They are very important. Deep structure and surface structure, which I know that maybe you read about them in the syntax. Deep structure and surface structure, which Chomsky used them. But what we mean by deep structure? By deep structure, representing the most abstract basic construct, the speaker starts from the discourse It is the definition of deep structure. You should know their definition. Another one is surface structure. Surface structure is a result of transformational procedures over the deep structure, representing that which the speaker or hearer actually pronounces or hears. Here we had the definition of deep structure and surface structure, which they are very important. You should know them. During the development of the theory, the view of deep and surface structure has changed. Early on, Chomsky himself, dissatisfied with the common use of these two technical terms into liberal context in numerous social sciences, abridged the names of phrases of D and S structure. Okay, Chomsky changed them to D or S structure, partly also changing the meaning of the symbols. Lately, S of deep structure, the common term, has been underlying. Another name for deep structure in the future was underlying structure. More recent models, such as government and binding, detached surface structure from the output and made this form abstract to a kind of intermediary between the underlying structure and the final utterance. In minimalism, the conception of deep and surface structure has been abandoned, but it seems to still be implicitly with us, and as after the operation merge, there is still some room left for transformation. Okay, here we can see the changes of the form of deep structure and surface structure in the different series of Chomsky. Okay, one of the alternative approaches that the author mentioned above, optimality theory, for instance, also renounces the distinction between deep and surface structure and accept only input and output. Use these two terms instead of them in minimalist. Still, these are also concealed constructs of the underlying surface forms, as they can be mutually significantly different under the influence of various constraints. Regardless of any terminological inconsistencies, it seems that the distinction between deep and surface structure remains one of the most important features of the generative theory. Okay, the differences between them are very important in generative linguistics or generative theory. It makes generative linguistics truly reductionist, as it shows that apparently complex structures can be significantly simplified in the formal system. Psychologically, during perception or production, this means that physical variables are constantly compared with the underlying abstract mental representation, and this further suggests that language is indeed a mental construct made up of hierarchically organized abstract structures and not of a series of sounds existing in the outside world. Indeed, the idea of the psychological duality of language makes Chomskyan linguistics generative in the mathematical sense of the word. Therefore, the ninth relevant legacy of a half a century of generative linguistics would be revived interest in language dualism and the resulting rise of reductionist theories, which persists to the present day. It is important. This line is important, that revived interest in the language dualism, the generative linguistics, and the resulting rise of reductionist theories, which persist to the present day. This reductionism originally led to the introduction of a few principles that were very much unseen before the early 60s. The most well-known one is certainly that of transformations. Transformation rules jumbling kernel sentences toward their ultimate spoken realization, subconsciously governed, yet possible to formally describe. They are related to the syntax. Traditionally, transformations lead a sentence from its deep toward its surface structure, like from its fundamental form, carrying meaning, devoid of any superfluous elements such as passive forms, inversions, or inflections, toward the utterance that is actually pronounced or heard. The status of the transformations has changed significantly through the years. Early approaches tended to add a new transformation for every new phenomenon noticed, which often made the theory very bulky. Such linguists seem to have forgotten the basic goal of the entire school, a simple and elegant theory of the mind. In the early 70s, generative semantics introduced transformation into the domain of meaning too. Should note that the generative semantics introduced the transformation into the domain of the meaning too, where complications at one moment threatened to disrupt the theory from within. Chomsky thus attempted to restore some order in terms of transformations, first by systematizing them and reducing their number, which resulted in his famous Pisa lecture, where the entire set of transformational rule was reduced to a simple principle today known as transforms alpha. They are the terms which are common in syntax. They are related to Chomsky and generative linguistics. Today, the minimalist model accepts a few fundamental transformations, so we can say they have remained one of the basic mechanisms of generative linguistics. Okay. Transformations, dear student, you should summarize that paragraph. You should know about the transformation, about the changes. Transformations need to be governed by some rules. Transformation need to be governed by some rules. Early generative linguistics introduced phrase structure rules and rules related to the lexicon, strict categorization, and lexicon insertion rules. More globally speaking, in traditional generative linguistic rules are binary, where the instruction will or will not execute like in computers. With these so-called Wolframness rules, there have been attempts at non-binary rules, not common in artificial intelligence, but apparently very much present in various forms of human perception, including understanding language structures. These rules originate from the early years of Gestalt psychology. They were introduced into linguistics as conversational implicator. You should know these changes and is related to other science. Set of pattern allowing the speaker and hearer to conduct a relative performance, a relative preference among a larger number of quite acceptable grammatical solutions. Jack and Dove, who later renamed the principles as preference rules. In the dissertation of Ross in the 1970s, these were called constraints. The name would prevail in late government and binding theory and minimalist program, while the concept would be brought to its extreme in optimality theory. In general, today it seems that generative grammar more and more renounces classical flexible rule in favor of constraint. Hence, the author suggests that renunciation of strict binary choices and consequent return to Gestalt principle of perception in the 11th important legacy of the more recent generative theory. It is important you should know that here the author suggests that renunciation of strict binary choices, and the consequent return to Gestalt principles of perception is the 11th important legacy of generative theory. You should know that. Okay, I think it is enough until this matter, and we introduce some concept and some terms which are common in generative linguistics. Please look at this video many times and to get the point and ask your question and do its test. In the name of God.